Dr. John Mendenhall knew that he was freezing to death because he had learned about the stages of hypothermia in medical school. Now, at first, your body starts to feel very, very cold, and then you start shivering. Now, shivering is how your body tries to generate heat and how it desperately tries to warm itself up. And as you become more hypothermic, your body will eventually stop shivering and you will become very confused and very tired. Now, it's really not an unpleasant feeling. It's just that you slowly slip off into a deep sleep, and then you will eventually fade into a coma. And shortly after this, you will experience death. Hello everyone, today I'm starting a new segment on my channel where I am going to be telling true stories that I found uplifting and inspirational. Now, today I found a fascinating story in a book called Physicians' Untold Stories by Dr. Scott Colbalba, MD. I'm going to put a link to this book in the description below. So the contributing author for today's story is Dr. John P. Mendenhall, MD, and the story is called Freezing Cold. Dr. Mendenhall had been excited about a planned trip with the Scouts in a branch of the Rocky Mountains with peaks as high as 13,000 foot elevation. It had been a beautiful fall day with crisp, clean air and breathtaking mountain views. The hike had been exhilarating, and as they hiked higher and higher into the mountains, into the thin air, the Scouts were excited about setting up camp on the side of the mountain. Now, Dr. Mendenhall hadn't realized how high of altitude they had reached until he was gradually becoming a little bit short of breath, he was noticing. He started to have trouble keeping up with the troop and eventually began wheezing a little bit, struggling to catch his breath, and at that point he knew he was getting mountain sickness because he felt fluid building up into his lungs, which is pulmonary edema. He needed to get to lower elevation in order to get medical attention. Now, the problem was that they were so far into the wilderness that it would be difficult for anybody to reach them quickly, and so they were thinking they probably would need to hike down to the bottom of the mountain. Or at least that was the plan. But what was happening as they were discussing their next move is there was a storm that had been brewing in the Rocky Mountains. It started as a little bit of a gentle breeze, and then a little bit of a snow, and then suddenly, very quickly, the weather turned very bad, and they were in the middle of a full-blown Rocky Mountain winter blizzard. They were suddenly engulfed in a very strong wind, and the visibility was only a few feet in front of their faces. The wind was howling and the snow was coming down really hard, and even the young Scouts would have to struggle to get down to the bottom of the mountain in this storm. Now, Dr. Mendenhall knew there was no way he was going to be able to hike down to the bottom of the mountain in his current condition. So in between the gasps, the doctor spoke with the other leaders of the troop, and they decided on their next move. They decided that the Scouts actually needed to get to the bottom of the mountain for safety, and he was not going to be able to travel with them because he was going to slow them down, and he was actually going to get in worse medical shape if he was trying to move around when he was getting this fluid building up into his lungs. So the plan was that he was going to stay aside in the trail, find a nice secure place, and the Scouts would go down to the bottom of the mountain and get some medical help, send up a rescue team to come get him to the bottom of the mountain, and then take care of him once they were able to do that. So once the team left, the doctor actually felt a little bit relieved because he was now going to be able to rest and catch his breath, and he couldn't catch his breath while he was on the move. Plus, he was kind of holding up the troop from going down quickly and putting them in danger, because if they were going to be waiting for him to move so slowly, they were going to be in the freezing cold storm longer than they needed to. So it was a good plan for him to just wait behind while the Scouts went down and tried to get a ranger and get a medical team to retrieve him off of the mountain. So once that happened and the Scouts had left, the doctor found a good place on a trail, kind of on the side where there were some trees kind of nestled around, and he could get a little bit of shelter from the snow coming down, and he crawled into his sleeping bag and kind of zipped it up and kind of huddled up to wait for rescue in the morning. Now, it was very, very early in the morning and it had gotten very cold. The temperature had dropped well below freezing and it was getting colder and colder by each minute. Now, Dr. Mendenhall was in a bit of a daze. He was kind of slipping in and out of consciousness, kind of being sometimes aware of what was going on around him, sometimes in a like blacked out sleeping state, and he was kind of going back and forth in the state for quite some time, and he didn't really know how long he had been waiting there. Now, as he was trying to get warm, he thought he heard in the distance the sound of crunching snow. You know, the sound that the snow makes when it's very, very cold and you hear something crunching, but he kind of blew it off because, you know, there was a lot going on around him and he was also slipping in and out of this state of consciousness. So he tried to get a little bit warmer, and what he did is he put the sleeping bag above his head and he kind of zipped it up so only the top crown of his head was showing, and he pulled his body together and he was kind of huddling close to get that body temperature to come up to kind of keep the body heat in the sleeping bag and try to stay warm so that he wouldn't freeze to death. But this plan could only work for so long in the freezing temperature, and he tried as best as he could to keep warm, but it was for no use. He started to shiver and he started to get very, very cold, and at first his chest kind of tensed up, and then his feet and his hands and his legs started to tremble a little bit, and then finally he started shivering more and more, and finally the shivering was so intense that his teeth were chattering really loud and he couldn't get that to stop. But after a while, the shivering kind of slowed a little bit, and he was kind of shivering a little bit less and less, and his eyes felt really, really heavy. And soon he stopped shivering altogether, and he's kind of like out of it, not really aware of what's happening, but he was surprised that he was feeling really kind of comfortable. And then he kind of started drifting into a deep sleep, and it may have occurred to him that, you know, I think I'm dying. But as he realized he was dying, he thought to himself, wow, this is actually going to be a pleasant way to die. And he kind of closed his eyes and he left them closed for 1 second, for another second, as he was drifting deep into unconsciousness. And he kind of laid silent there for a couple of more seconds, and then suddenly, out of the blue, he hears, "Wake up! Wake up!" And he like jumps, kind of startled. He kind of peeks his head out of the sleeping bag, and there's the face of a forest ranger just standing there, and there's a horse behind him. Like, how weird is this? So what had happened is there was a forest ranger who had been up on the mountain at a much higher elevation, but he was on horseback, so he was making his way down to the bottom of the mountain when he sees the sleeping bag kind of huddled up in a corner, and he realizes there's a human in that sleeping bag, and he jumps off the horse and tries to stir out of unconsciousness Dr. Mendenhall's unconscious body. So Dr. Mendenhall, again, he's so out of it that he's kind of annoyed that somebody woke him up out of this beautiful, peaceful sleep. But the forest ranger wasn't fazed. He takes Dr. Mendenhall and he kind of shakes him. He kind of helps him get out of the sleeping bag, and he wraps him in the blanket, and he's like, we got to get out of here. We got to get down off this mountain. We got to get down out of the blizzard. And he gets Dr. Mendenhall on the back of his horse, and they ride the bumpy ride all the way down to the bottom of the mountain, and there they find the ranger station. Now, once they got to the ranger station, the ranger was able to arrange him to get the doctor to the hospital, and it was kind of funny because the doctor gets to the hospital. He already knew half of the staff because he was a doctor there. So now the doctor had been coming to his senses. He was getting some warmth. They had taken a chest x-ray, and when he looked at the chest x-ray, he couldn't believe it. I mean, his lungs were so full of fluid that it actually looked like the blizzard that they had just escaped from. He was wondering how could he have possibly gotten any oxygen into his lungs with his chest in such bad condition, loaded up with fluid. Eventually, the doctor made a full recover. It took him a few days to get warmed up and reunited with fluid. fluids, and he was released a few days later, sent home to be with his family and resume his normal life. So years had passed since Dr. Mendenhall's near-death freezing experience, and he was on his way to work one day at about 5:30 in the morning, which is the time he went to the hospital pretty much every single morning. So his typical morning routine was to leave very early, go to the hospital, do his rounds, go into surgery, and then after surgery stop off at the office and finish up all his work for the day. But for some reason this particular day, he felt the urge to go straight into the office and not go directly to the hospital to do his rounds. So he is sitting in the office, and it's about 10 to 6 a.m. and he's at his desk thinking, I wonder why I'm here. I mean, I really don't have that much work to do. Why did I decide to come into the office? And then he heard this loud noise. Bam, bam, bam! It was a pounding of the back door. And he's like, what's that all about? I mean, the staff doesn't even get here till 8 a.m. Who could that be? And so he opens the door, and there's this man standing there sobbing at the back door. And the man says, I've suffered this terrible loss. And he's crying and he's sobbing. And Dr. Mendenhall, being the nice man that he was, took the man inside and set him down and kind of rubbed his shoulder, asked if he wanted a cup of coffee, and asked him what was going on. I just suffered a terrible loss, the man said, and tears were streaming down his face, and he was sobbing uncontrollably, and he could barely get out the words to his story. My son was just hiking in the canyon, and he got separated from the group, and they just found him frozen to death, and the man is just unconsolable at this point. The man could barely catch his breath, and between sobs he said, I can't imagine how much my boy had to suffer. It must have been so painful. It must have been so terrible. I can't stop thinking of it. And he just kept crying and was unconsolable. And at that moment, the doctor understood exactly what had driven him to go into the office that early in the morning, which was so different than his usual schedule. And he said to the man, I have a story I want to tell you, and I hope it's going to make you feel better. And at that moment, he explained in a very loving and tender way that it was not an unpleasant experience at all, and that his son must have been very peaceful before he passed, and that he would not have suffered. So he told the story of how he had been in that situation, that he had almost died, and before his rescue he had felt a very calm sense of peace and love, and had realized that was not an unpleasant way to die. Now, at this final moment, the man's disposition changed, and he listened very intently on every single word that came out of the mouth of the doctor. By the time he finished, the man was calm, and it had been a really short visit. The man didn't learn the name of the doctor didn't learn the name of the man, but he has said thank you, and he went on his way. And then Dr. Mendenhall eventually went into work and worked the day and went home for the evening. And while he was sitting there watching the evening news, there was a story about how a boy had been found the night before frozen to death in a nearby canyon. And the doctor wondered why he had stopped in the office before rounds when he had never done that before, and why the grieving father chose to knock on that exact door out of all the doors of the medical offices in that particular complex, and how he knew just exactly what to say to make the man feel better. And in that moment, his only conclusion was that they were brought together by a loving creator or a force in the universe in order for him to provide comfort and peace to an anguished father's soul. And he never saw that father again. So that's it. That's the end of my story, Freezing Cold. I do have a link to the book in the description below. Check out the book. It has 26 fascinating stories submitted by doctors. Now, my name is Dawn Dickinson. If you like the story and would like to hear more stories like that, put something in the comments below. Also, if you enjoyed the video, please do me a favor and hit the thumbs up. Please subscribe to the channel. I put videos out every single week. I hope to see you back here on the channel next week.